On the third morning of November, in the long gallery of Whitcomb Hall, the Duke of Ravensmere stood before a painted woman and wept without sound. He did this every morning at the same hour, the servants said, and the servants had learned not to be seen seeing it. The portrait showed a young woman in a pale green gown, her hand resting on the head of a greyhound, her face turned slightly, as though someone had just spoken her name. The brass plate beneath it read only a date, and the single word, beloved. The Duke pressed 2 fingers to his mouth and let his shoulders fall, and the gallery held its breath around him, the way a room holds the silence after a clock has stopped. Behind a half-open door at the gallery's far end, a woman in a grey servant's gown stood with a basket of folded linen against her hip, and did not move. She was 24, slight, with chestnut hair pinned plainly beneath a white cap, and her hands had gone cold around the wicker. She knew that gown. She knew that greyhound dead these 8 years. She knew the turn of that painted head because she had sat for it in a sunlit morning room, while a fire spat and her mother scolded her for fidgeting. The woman in the doorway was the woman on the wall. And the man weeping believed her dead. Stay with me through this one. What happened in that gallery took 12 years to undo, and the undoing was worth every hour. I will tell it slowly, the way it deserves. The household called her Mary Combe. She had come to Whitcomb Hall in early autumn as an under-housemaid hired by the steward on the strength of a forged character and a quiet manner, and for 6 weeks she had kept her head down and her face turned from the light. For the great house, she was a pair of hands that carried linen and laid fires and vanished when a gentleman entered a room. She was nobody. That was the entire purpose of her, and she had built it carefully. Stitch by stitch, the way she had once been taught to build a sampler. Her name had been Eleanor, Eleanor of the Hartleys of Carden Abbey, before the sea took it from her. The daughter of a baronet whose lands marched along the Duke's, she had been 17 and promised, in the soft unspoken way of 2 families who liked each other, to the young Marquess who would one day be Duke of Ravensmere. There had been an understanding. There had been a green gown, and a portrait commissioned to mark the betrothal that was meant to follow her come of age. Then there had been a packet ship to her aunt in Lisbon, a storm off the Bay of Biscay, a list of the lost printed in the London papers, and her name upon it, drowned at 17. The world had closed the book and moved on, and so she had believed, had he. Yet what the world did not know was that she had not drowned. She had been pulled half dead from the water by a Portuguese fishing family who could not read the names sewn into her shift, and she had spent 4 years in a country whose language she learned from the inside out, and then another 4 working her passage and her wits back across a continent at war. She had buried her father by hearsay, learned of the entail that had passed her family's house to a cousin she despised, and arrived home at last to a country that had no place set for a dead girl. She had nothing. No name she could safely use, no proof of who she was that a magistrate would credit, no family left to vouch for her. To England she was a rumor with a forged character and chapped hands. The hall pressed on her in the particular way that great houses press on the people who keep them running. She woke before the light, and carried coal upstairs that were not meant for her feet. She was addressed, when she was addressed at all, in the clipped grammar reserved for those whose names did not matter. The housekeeper, a rigid woman named Mrs. Pell, had decided within a day that the new girl was sullen, and said so. To the upper servants, she was the quiet one, the strange one, the one who flinched from the portraits in the gallery as though they might speak. She let them think it. It was safer than the truth. The Duke himself she had not meant to see at all. Garrick had been 23 when she sailed, a serious young man with a way of going very still when he was moved, and she had loved him with the whole uncomplicated certainty of a girl who had never been taught to expect loss. She had told herself, across all those years and miles, that he would have married long ago, that a duke could not mourn a baronet's drowned daughter forever, that she would come home to find him with a duchess and a nursery and a settled face, and that she would be glad of it, because gladness was cheaper than grief. She had built her whole return around the certainty that he had forgotten her. He had not forgotten her. He wept at her portrait every morning. And she had stumbled into the one house in England where her face hung on a wall. The first time he spoke to her directly, it was to give a command. She had been kneeling at the library hearth, coaxing a sullen fire, when he came in earlier than the household expected, and stopped at the sight of her. She kept her face to the coals. She heard him cross the carpet. She felt, with the old animal accuracy that had not died in her, exactly where he stood in the room, 3 feet behind her left shoulder, close enough that the cold air he carried in from the corridor reached her neck. Her heart went hard against her ribs. Her hand holding the bellows did not shake because she would not permit it. "Leave the fire," he said. His voice had deepened in the years between, but the low-level register of it was the same, and it went through her like a key turning in a lock she had forgotten she carried. "You will catch your death on that stone floor. Sit in the chair until you have warmed." It was an order. A housemaid did not sit in a duke's library chair, and they both knew it, and the absurdity of the command was its own kind of tenderness, though she could not afford to hear the tenderness in it.
"I am quite warm, your grace,"
she said, pitching her voice low and rough. Nothing like the voice that had once sung to him across a music room. "I will finish and go." He did not move for a long moment. She felt his attention on the back of her bent neck like sun through glass. "You are not from this county," he said at last. It was not a question. Your manner of speech, it is wrong for the place. "From the north, your grace." The lie came smoothly. "Many years away." A pause that lasted too long. She heard him move to the window, not to the door, and stand looking out at the gray park, and she understood that he was not finished with her, that something about the kneeling figure at his hearth had caught on a hook in him he could not name. "There was a fire in this room every morning when I was a boy," he said as though to the glass. "My mother saw to it herself. She did not trust the servants to keep it laid. I have kept the habit of an early fire long after I had any reason for it." He was quiet a moment. "I do not know why I tell you this." The roughness in his own voice seemed to surprise him. Then his boots on the carpet, retreating, and the door. And her breath let out all at once in a long shudder she had been holding since he entered. She knelt there with the bellows in her cold hands, and understood that she had made a catastrophic error in coming to this house, and that she did not, God help her, want to leave it. Her own mother had laid fires too in the cold mornings at Carden Abbey, and had said the very same thing about servants. And Eleanor had nearly turned at the window and told him so. And the nearness of that betrayal frightened her more than discovery would have. She finished the fire. She did not let her hand shake. She carried her cold great pen down the back stair, and pressed her forehead for one moment against the cool plaster of the passage wall, and let herself feel, just once, how badly she had wanted to stay in that room. She should have left. That was the thing she would turn over in the months to come, the choice that was not a choice. A wiser woman would have given notice that very week, taken her forged character to a household in another county, and let the dead stay dead. Garrick had built a life around her absence the way ivy builds itself around the shape of a fallen tree. And to return to him now was not a gift. It was a demolition. If she stepped into the light and said her name, she would not be restoring something. She would be tearing down 12 years of his careful grief and asking him to feel it all again as joy. And what if the joy did not come? What if he looked at her chapped hands and her servant's gown, and the 4 years she could not account for, and saw, not Eleanor, but a stranger wearing her drowned face? The fear of that was larger than the fear of discovery. So she stayed, and watched, and kept her cap low, and told herself it was only for a little while. The household had its own pressures, and they were closing. The Duke's aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere, had come to Whitcomb Hall in October with a clear and stated purpose, and the purpose was a wedding. She was a handsome, upright woman of 60, with a voice like cool water poured over stones, and she had decided that her nephew's mourning had become an indulgence the family could no longer afford. There was no heir. There was a dukedom that would pass, if Garrick died without a son, to a branch of the family the dowager considered barely respectable. She had brought with her, installed in the best guest apartments, a solution. Her name was Lady Augusta Vane, and she was everything the season approved of. Lady Augusta was 23, fair, accomplished, and entirely without doubt. She played the pianoforte without error, and conversed without warmth, and wore ice-blue silk that the dowager had chosen for its effect against the gallery's gilt. She had been raised from the cradle to be exactly this, a duchess in waiting, and she carried the certainty of it the way other women carried a fan. She was not cruel. She was simply incapable of imagining a world arranged any way other than the way that flattered her, and into that world a sullen under-housemaid did not enter at all, except as an obstacle to be removed if she proved untidy. It was the dowager who first put the label on Eleanor, and she did it without even looking. Eleanor had been crossing the upper landing with an armful of bed linen when the dowager and Lady Augusta came along the corridor, and Eleanor had pressed herself to the wall as servants did. The dowager's eye passed over her once the way an eye passes over a piece of furniture that has been set slightly wrong. "That one is new," she said to the housekeeper trailing behind. "She has a furtive look." "I do not care for furtive servants. See that she is kept below stairs when there is company. The plain ones unsettle the eye." And she went on, and the words settled on Eleanor's shoulders like ash, the plain one, the furtive one. The one to be kept out of sight. She stood against the wall with the linen crushed to her chest, and felt the old cold accuracy tell her that the Duke had stopped at the head of the stairs behind his aunt, and had heard, and was looking at her. She did not look back. She fixed her eyes on the floor and counted the boards and waited for them to pass, and only when the corridor was empty did she breathe. He had heard the label fastened to her, and something in the quality of the silence behind her had changed. The thing that undid her caution, in the end, was a child. The Duke kept in his household his late sister's son, a boy of 7 named Tom, dark-haired and grave and prone to the kind of nightmares that come to children who have lost their mother. The nurse was elderly and slept hard. It was Eleanor, carrying a candle along the night corridor on some errand of Mrs. Pell's, who heard the boy crying behind his door, and Eleanor, who went in without thinking. Because a crying child is a thing a person goes to, and she had been a person before she was a housemaid. She found him sitting up in the dark, rigid, with the particular terror of a dream he could not climb out of, his small hands fisted in the counterpane, and his breath coming in the short, hard gusts of a child who has been crying too long to remember why. "There was water," he said when he saw her, the words tumbling out. "There was water, and it took her, and I could not reach her hand." Eleanor's own chest closed at that, because she knew the dream from the inside, had lived a version of it that was not a dream at all, and she did the things her own mother had once done. She lit his candle from hers, so the dark drew back into the corners where it could be borne. She sat on the edge of the bed and did not touch him until he reached for her, because a frightened child must be the one to close the distance. And then she held him and let him shake against her shoulder until the shaking eased. She did not tell him the water was not real. She told him instead, in a low, even voice, an old story about a greyhound who could outrun the wind, a long-legged, foolish dog who was forever wandering off after rabbits and hares and the smell of the river, and who was lost 100 times in his long life, and yet always found his way home. Through any storm. Scratching at the kitchen door at dawn, with his coat full of burrs and his tail going like a flag. "Even through the water?" the boy asked, and she said yes, even through the water, because a dog like that does not drown. A dog like that swims until his feet touch the far bank, and then he shakes himself and trots home. And the boy's breathing slowed as she spoke, and his fists came loose, and somewhere in the middle of the second telling, he slid down into sleep with with his cheek on her arm. She did not know that the Duke, summoned by the nurse who had woken at last, stood in the open doorway and did not enter. She did not know he heard the story. She did not know that the greyhound in it had been real, had been hers, had appeared in a portrait in his gallery with its head beneath a painted girl's hand, and that the sound of a strange housemaid telling his nephew that the dog always found its way home through any storm had stopped the Duke of Ravensmere where he stood with his hand on the doorframe, and his face gone white in the candlelight. He did not speak of it. In the morning, a small thing changed, and then another. A fire she had not yet reached was found already burning. A heavier task was reassigned to a footman before she could be set to it. Once crossing the courtyard in a cold rain, she found the Duke's own steward waiting with an umbrella and a stiff explanation that his Grace did not wish the maids to take chills. She read each of these as coincidence, then as the household's ordinary order, then with a slow rising dread, as attention. He was watching her. He did not know who she was. He only knew that a quiet woman had told his nephew a story about a dog that came home, and that he could not stop himself from wanting her kept warm and dry and unburdened, and he had no idea why, and the not knowing was eating at him. I promised you his mask would crack before he understood it, and this was the first crack. He felt the pull of her and called it pity. He was wrong, and somewhere beneath the wrongness he knew it. The second voicing of the label came at the dinner the Dowager arranged to display Lady Augusta to the county. The dining room at Whitcomb Hall seated 30 beneath a ceiling painted with clouds, and the candles ran the length of the great table in a river of light, and Eleanor was sent up to help carry, because 2 of the regular footmen had taken fever. She stood at the sideboard with her eyes down while the county ate, and she heard the Dowager, 2 glasses of hock into her campaign, address the table at large. "Garrick keeps such a strange establishment," she said, gay and carrying. "Do you know he has a housemaid who frightens the children? The plain, furtive creature from the north. I have told him a dozen times to turn her off, but he has grown sentimental in his age and will not part with a single soul. Even the dull ones. Even the ones who unsettle the eye." A ripple of obliging laughter went down the table. Lady Augusta smiled into her wine, and Eleanor, standing perfectly still at the sideboard with a dish of buttered parsnips going cold in her hands, felt her own face heat and her own breath catch, and knew that the Duke, at the head of the table, had set down his fork. "Mary," he said. The whole table heard the chill in it, and mistook the direction. He was looking at his aunt, not at the maid. "Lady Ravensmere mistakes the matter. The child sleeps better since that woman came. You will not speak of turning her off again. It was the wrong thing to say, in front of the county. And he knew it, and he said it anyway, and the Dowager's mouth thinned to a line." Eleanor set down the parsnips before her hands could betray her. She felt the warmth of his defense and the danger of it in the same instant, 2 currents pulling opposite ways in her chest, and she understood that the longer she stayed, the more she cost him, and the less able she was to leave. The midpoint of all things came on a gray afternoon in the gallery where it had begun. Eleanor had been sent to dust the long room while the family rode out, and she had thought herself alone, and she had done the thing she had forbidden herself to do. She had stood before her own portrait and looked at it. The painted girl looked back, 17 and certain, her hand on the greyhound, her whole life ahead of her like a hall of lit rooms. Eleanor lifted her bare reddened hand and held it in the air, an inch from the painted hand, comparing, and did not hear the Duke come in until he spoke from the doorway, and his voice was not level at all. "You stand exactly as she stood," he said. She turned. He was alone. He had not ridden out. He stood with his hat still in his hand and the gray light on his face, and an expression she had never been permitted to see in 12 years. And what had broken in him was breaking still, in real time, in front of her. He came down the gallery slowly, and he was not looking at the portrait, he was looking at her. "I have tried," he said low, "to understand why a duke should lie awake thinking of a housemaid's chapped hands. I told myself it was the boy. I told myself it was charity. I am not a man who lies well even to himself. He stopped an arm's length away. When you told Tom that story about the dog that comes home through any storm. I had a dog once in this house. It belonged to a girl. She drowned 12 years ago, and I have not had a peaceful morning since, and I do not know your face. And I cannot stop looking at it. His jaw worked. Forgive me. You will think me mad. I bury her every morning at the wall there, and I cannot do it any longer if you are going to stand in my house wearing her stillness. This was his wound, laid down between them on the gallery floor, and she had to choose, in that breath, between the cruelty of a lie and the cruelty of a truth, and she found she could do neither cleanly. "Your Grace," she said, and her northern roughness slipped, and a little of the music came back into the word. "You should not say such things to a servant." He heard it. She watched him hear it, the shift in her voice, the vowel that did not belong to any north. His stillness went absolute. For one long moment, the whole gallery hung on the edge of the truth. And then she did, the cowardly, merciful thing. She dropped a curtsy, kept her face down, and walked from the room on legs that barely held her, and left him standing before the portrait of the woman he had just confessed he could not stop seeing in the living one. She wept that night in her cold attic room, not for grief, but for the size of what she was carrying, and she resolved again to leave, and again did not. The dowager was not a stupid woman, and she had begun to watch her nephew watch the housemaid. She did not understand it. She did not need to. She understood only that the wedding she had built was being threatened by something below stairs, and she moved to crush it with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 60 years arranging the world. She had Mrs. Peld bring her the new maid's character, and she read the forged document with a cold eye and found, as a determined person will always find, the small inconsistencies in it. A reference from a household that upon a letter of inquiry proved not to exist, a date that did not align. By the first week of December, the dowager had assembled enough to be certain the girl was a fraud, and she chose her moment with care. She chose the great winter ball. The ball at Whitcomb Hall was the largest the county had seen in a decade. 200 candles and an orchestra and the whole neighborhood in silk, and it was the arena where the dowager intended to announce her nephew's engagement to Lady Augusta, whether her nephew willed it or not. She had told the county it would happen. She had told Lady Augusta. She had not told Garrick, who had refused her 3 times, because the dowager had learned long ago that a thing announced before 200 witnesses is harder to refuse than a thing proposed in private. Eleanor was not meant to be at the ball. She was meant to be below stairs, washing glasses, kept out of sight, as the dowager had ordered from the first day. The dowager, however, wanted her seen. That was the cruelty of the plan, and its cleverness. Midway through the evening, with the dancing at its height, and the Duke standing grave and trapped beside Lady Augusta and his aunt, the dowager sent word below stairs that the new maid, Mary Combe, was to be brought up to the ballroom at once on a matter concerning her character. And so Eleanor was marched up the servants' stair and through a side door into the blazing light of the ballroom, in her gray gown, before 200 people in silk, and the music faltered and stopped. "There she is," the dowager said. Into the silence, her voice the cool water over stones. "I am sorry to interrupt the dancing, but I find I cannot in good conscience let this house harbor a deception any longer." She held up the forged character between 2 fingers. "This woman came to us under a false name and a forged reference. The household she claims to have served does not exist. I have made inquiries. She is not Mary Combe. She is nobody at all. A vagrant who lied her way into a duke's house, and I will have the magistrate to her tonight." She turned to the room, gathering her witnesses. "I tell you all this so that you may see what sentiment does to a great family. My nephew has so indulged his grief that he can no longer tell a worthy person from a worthless one. He defends this creature. This furtive, plain, drowned-looking nobody. Look at her and tell me she belongs in this room." And it was the 3rd voicing of the label, and it was meant to be the last. and it was delivered to 200 witnesses with a magistrate already sent for. The room turned to look at the woman in gray. Lady Augusta's chin lifted in cool triumph. The Duke had gone the color of ash, and Eleanor stood in the center of the blazing floor, with every eye in the county upon her. The thing she had most feared come fully to pass, and felt rising through the terror something she had not expected. Not fear. The other thing. The thing that had kept her alive through 4 years of a foreign sea and 4 years of walking home. She lifted her head. She reached up and took the white cap from her hair and let the chestnut fall, and she straightened her spine the way her mother had taught her to straighten it in rooms exactly like this one. And when she spoke, her voice was not rough and not northern. It was clear and low and entirely her own, and it carried to the back of the room. "My name," she said, "is Eleanor Hartley. My father was Sir Edmund Hartley of Carden Abbey, whose lands run to the river that bounds this estate. I did not drown 12 years ago. I was pulled from the sea off the coast of Portugal by people who could not read my name, and it has taken me 8 years to come home. And when I came home, I found my father dead, my house entailed away, and my name on a list of the lost that no one had any reason to question. I took a false name because I had no true one left that the law would credit. That much of your Grace's charge is honest. I am a fraud in every particular but one." She turned then and looked for the first time directly at the Duke, across the whole blazing length of the room. "I am the woman in your gallery. I sat for that portrait in my mother's morning room when I was 17. The dog's name was Hero. I told your nephew he always came home through any storm, because I needed to believe it of myself." The silence in the ballroom was total. 200 people did not breathe. The dowager's hand, holding the forged character, had begun very slightly to shake. Garrick crossed the room. He did not hurry. He came through the parting crowd in long, even strides, past his aunt, past Lady Augusta in her ice-blue silk, past the orchestra frozen over its instruments, and he stopped before her closer than any duke had ever stood before any servant in that house, and he looked at her face as though he were reading a letter he had waited 12 years to receive. His own face was wet. He reached up slowly, and his hand hovered an inch from her cheek, the way her own hand had hovered an inch from the painted hand, and then he let it rest against her jaw, and she felt the whole 12 years go through him at the touch. "Eleanor," he said. Only her name. He had not said it aloud in 12 years, and it broke on the way out. Then he turned, with his hand still warm against her face, and he addressed the room in a voice that did not rise, but reached every corner of it. "This is Eleanor Hartley, and I will marry her," he said at once. He did not explain it, did not defend it, did not soften it. The line landed in the silence the room had built, and it could not be unsaid, because 200 witnesses had heard it, and that was the whole point, and his aunt had taught him the lesson herself. The dowager's composure came apart in pieces. The forged character slipped from her fingers to the floor. "This is absurd," she said, but the cool water had gone out of her voice and left only the stones. "You cannot. There is no proof. A drowned girl, a servant, a fraud by her own admission. You cannot mean to throw away the family on a face." She looked around the room for the witnesses who had laughed at her dinner table, and found them looking instead at the woman in gray. And she understood too late that the room had turned. That recognition had moved through it, like warmth through cold water. That old Lady Marbury near the windows was saying to her neighbor that yes, yes. She remembered the Hartley girl had danced at her christening. That was the Hartley chin, without a doubt. And the proof came, as proof in this world comes, slowly and from the edge of the frame. The Duke's steward, who had brought an umbrella to a maid in the rain and wondered ever since at his master's strange concern, had served the household 30 years and remembered old Sir Edmund well. The family solicitor, present at the ball, recalled that the betrothal portrait had been commissioned and paid for by the late Duke himself, that the painter, still living in the next county, had taken sketches that survived. A miniature, it would later be found, hung still in a locked drawer of the late Duke's desk, painted from the same sittings, with her name and the date inked on its reverse in the old Duke's hand. The dead girl's identity, which no single person could have proven alone, assembled itself from a dozen people who had each held one corner of it, and the dowager's certainty dissolved against it like salt. She did not rage. She was, in the end, too well-bred for that, and the niche of the story had no use for her destruction, only her correction. She stood very straight amid the wreckage of her plan, and looked at her nephew, and at the woman whose face she had called plain and furtive and drowned, and something in her 60-year-old certainty gave way to something older and quieter. "Hartley," she said almost to herself. "Edmund, Hartley's girl." She had known Sir Edmund. She had not been able to see the daughter through the servant's cap because she had not expected to, and a person sees what she expects. "I have done you a wrong, then," she said stiffly to Eleanor. "And it cost her. And the room heard it cost her. And that was enough." It was all the niche required. Lady Augusta, who was not stupid either, gathered her ice-blue silk and her dignity, and removed herself from a field she had clearly lost, and within a season would be engaged elsewhere, and would be, by all accounts, a perfectly contented countess who never spoke of Whitcomb Hall again. The magistrate, when he arrived, was given brandy and an apology and sent home. They were married quietly in the spring, in the small church on the estate, with the county invited, but the day kept gentle, no river of 200 candles, only the morning light through old glass and a handful of people who mattered. Tom carried the ring on a cushion and did not drop it. The steward wept openly and was not ashamed. The dowager attended in gray, which the county noticed and understood, and she sat in the family pew and watched the drowned girl come up the aisle alive. And if her face was unreadable, her presence was its own correction, and Eleanor, passing, inclined her head to her, and the old woman inclined hers back. "If you have stayed with me to hear, I am glad of it, and I think Eleanor would be too. There is a little more, and it is the part that matters most." The portrait did not come down from the gallery. Garrick had thought in the first giddy days to take it away, to put the painted girl in storage now that the living one was warming his halls. Eleanor would not let him. She walked the gallery with him on a snowbound morning the winter after their wedding, the two of them and the boy Tom, between them, and they stopped before the pale green gown, and the painted greyhound, and the brass plate that read, "Beloved." She put her hand on the boy's dark head, exactly as the painted hand rested on the painted dog. And she looked up at the 17-year-old she had been, the girl who had thought her life was a hall of lit rooms, and had been right, only the rooms had taken longer to reach than she had imagined. "Leave it," she said. She waited too. She is the one who told Tom that the dog comes home. And Garrick, who had wept at that portrait every morning for 12 years, stood beside his wife and his nephew, and did not weep because the thing the portrait had promised had arrived. And a man does not mourn what is standing warm beside him, with snow falling outside the long windows and a child's hand in his. The greyhound in the painting had been named Hero. There was a new pup in the kennels that spring, leggy and absurd, and the boy named it Hero without being told to, because the story said the dog always came home, and a child believes a story he has been told by the right person in the dark. The pup slept across Eleanor's feet in the evenings, while the fire burned down. On the snowbound morning in the gallery, she had looked at the portrait a long moment and then turned her back on it deliberately, to face the windows and the white falling light and the living room behind her, because she had spent enough of her life standing behind a man who wept, and she did not intend to spend another hour there. The painted girl could keep watching the door. The living one was already through it. Snow fell on the long windows of Whitcomb Hall, and the fire held, and somewhere below a child was teaching a clumsy pup to come when called. She came home through the storm. She always had. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's long way home moved you, leave a comment and tell me the moment it found you, and I will read every one.